The Observer's High Commander Verthex stood at the observation deck of his flagship and watched the distant green world spinning slowly in the void of space. He had spent 40 cycles planning this moment, and now his invasion fleet of 200 warships waited at the edge of the star system like predators ready to strike Kepler 4. 42b was everything the Sindari Collective needed, and it was a garden world with breathable air and fertile soil and vast oceans. Filled with resources, the planet would make a perfect addition to their empire, and Verthex intended to claim it before any other power could stake their flag upon its surface. "High Commander," a voice called from behind him, and he turned to see Fleet Tactician Silvera approaching. With a data tablet clutched in her four-fingered hands, she was younger than most officers at her rank, and her blue-scaled skin still held the bright shine of youth, but Verthex valued her mind above all else because she saw patterns that others missed. "What news do you bring me?" he asked. "Our long-range scouts have completed their survey of the planet," she replied, and her voice carried a note of concern that made Verthex narrow his three eyes. "The Galactic Council has established a training academy on the northern continent, and it appears to be a joint facility where multiple species send their young officers to learn cooperation and diplomacy." Verthex waved one of his clawed hands dismissively and said, "Cadets are no threat to U.S., and they are children playing at war while we bring the real thing to their doorstep." Silver shifted her weight from one foot to the other, and this small movement told Verthex that she had more to say. "Speak freely," he commanded. "High Commander." "There is a complication," she said, and she pulled up an image on her data tablet, showing a group of bipedal creatures with smooth skin in various shades of brown and pink and tan. A contingent of humans arrived at the academy 3 rotations ago. The word hung in the air between them like a toxic cloud Verthex had never encountered humans directly, but he had heard the stories that spread through conquered species. Like a plague of fear, they called the human homeworld a death world, and this was not an exaggeration or myth, but a classification used by the Galactic Council itself. Earth was a planet where gravity crushed bones and extreme temperatures could kill in minutes, and the very atmosphere slowly destroyed metal through a process the humans casually called rust. The water that fell from Earth's sky could freeze into projectiles or supercharge with electricity or spin into massive storms that leveled entire settlements. The ground itself would shake and split open without warning, and mountains would explode and cover the land in molten rock, and somehow the humans had not just survived on this nightmare world, but they had thrived and conquered and spread across every corner of it before reaching out into the stars. "How many humans are present at the academy?" Verthex asked, and his voice remained steady, even as something cold settled in his stomach. 37. Silvera answered, and she pulled up more data showing the human cadets engaged in various training exercises. They are all young by their species standards, and most are between 18 and 22 of their years, and none have seen actual combat. Verthex studied the images carefully, and he saw the humans running obstacle courses and practicing hand-to-hand combat and operating various pieces of equipment. They looked unremarkable at first glance, and their bodies were soft and hairless, and they lacked claws or fangs or armored plates, but there was something in the way they moved that unsettled him, and it was a kind of casual confidence that suggested they feared nothing in the universe. "They are merely cadets," Verthex said finally, and he was speaking as much to convince himself as to address Silvera. "How dangerous can their offspring possibly be when they have no experience and no proper weapons and no fleet to support them?" Silvera did not answer immediately, and her silence spoke volumes. "High Commander, I recommend we deploy a surveillance drone to observe the academy before we proceed with the invasion," she said carefully. "If there is any threat, we should identify it now rather than discover it when our troops are already committed to the ground assault." Verthex considered her words and found wisdom in them. He had not risen to the rank of High Commander by ignoring the counsel of intelligent subordinates, and Silvera had never steered him wrong before. Very well, he agreed, and he turned back to the observation window to gaze at the distant green world. Deploy the drone and establish a secure surveillance feed, and we will observe these humans for 3 rotations before we begin our conquest. He clasped his hands behind his back and stood tall with the confidence of a commander who had won dozens of campaigns. I expect we will find nothing of concern, he added, and in 3 rotations we will descend upon that world and add it to our empire. And these human cadets will learn what real warriors look like. Silvera saluted and departed to carry out his orders, and Verthex remained at the window alone with his thoughts. He told himself that his caution was merely prudent and not a sign of fear. He told himself that stories of Deathworlders were exaggerated, tales meant to frighten children. He told himself that 37 young humans could not possibly pose a threat to 200 warships and 50,000 trained soldiers. But somewhere deep in his mind, a small voice whispered that he was making a terrible mistake. He pushed that voice aside and focused on the green world before him and imagined the glory that would soon be his. Surveillance drone launched an hour later, and it shot through space like a silver needle aimed at the heart of Kepler 442b would reach the planet in 6 hours, and then Verthex would see these Deathworlders for himself. He expected to be reassured by what the drone showed him, expected to laugh at his own caution, and proceed with the invasion as planned. He could not have been more wrong about what he was about to witness. The drone would show him something that would shake his confidence to its very foundation and make him question everything he thought he knew about war and survival and the nature of dangerous species. But for now, he stood at his window and watched the stars and waited, and told himself that everything would go according to plan. 3 rotations. From now, he would either be celebrating a glorious victory or running for his life. He just did not know it yet. The exercise. The morning sun rose over the academy and cast golden light across the sprawling campus where cadets from a dozen different species gathered in the central courtyard. Academy Commandant Zrivesh stood before them on a raised platform, and her ancient scales shimmered with colors that shifted between blue and green as she moved. She was old by Torvani standards and had served in 3 different conflicts before retiring to this teaching position, and she had seen more combat than most of the young ones before her could imagine. Attention, cadets, she called out, and her voice carried across the courtyard with practiced authority. Today you will face a surprise training exercise, and you will have no time to prepare and know. Warning about what challenges await you. A fierce murmur rippled through the assembled cadets, and the Elorians exchanged nervous glances while the Kethra began running calculations on their wrist devices. The Malvari stood perfectly still and silent as their culture demanded, and the humans just smiled at each other like they had been waiting for exactly this moment. The scenario is as follows, Commandant Zrivesh continued, and she activated a holographic display that showed the Academy grounds. From above, an enemy fleet has been detected at the edge of the star system, and they will reach planetary orbit in exactly 1 hour, and your task is to construct defensive positions using only the materials available in our supply depot and the surrounding wilderness. She paused and let her words sink in before adding, each species contingent will be assigned a sector to defend, and you will be graded on creativity and efficiency, and the tactical soundness of your preparations. Begin. Now, the non-human cadets immediately fell into their species' typical patterns of behavior. The Elorians formed a circle and began debating the optimal geometric arrangements for their defensive structures, and they argued about angles and sight lines and cover positions with the intensity of scholars defending their research. The Kethra sat down cross-legged and started calculating probability matrices to determine the most likely attack vectors, and they would not move until their numbers told them exactly what to do. The Mulvari requested permission to contact their homeworld for guidance from their tactical archives, and they believed that ancient wisdom always trumped modern improvisation. But the humans did something different. They looked at each other for maybe 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds something passed between them that no translator could capture. It was not words or signals or any form of communication that the other species recognized. Cadet Sergeant Maria Santos cracked her knuckles and grinned and said, "All right, people, we have got 60 minutes, so let us make this interesting." And then they exploded into motion. The human cadets split into teams without any visible discussion or assignment, and they seemed to know exactly what each person should do based on nothing more than instinct and familiarity. Santos pointed at Cadet Chun and said, "High ground observation post, and I want eyes on every approach within 15 minutes. Chun nodded once and took off running toward a 40-meter cliff face at the edge of their assigned sector. The other cadets watched in horror as Chun began climbing the sheer rock wall without any safety equipment and without any ropes or harnesses or nets below. To catch her, if she fell, she scaled that cliff like gravity was merely a suggestion, and her fingers found holds. That seemed impossible, and her body moved with a fluid grace that defied the danger she was in. "Is she insane?" a Kethra cadet whispered. "No." Another human replied casually as he jogged past carrying an armful of metal pipes. "She is just from Colorado, and she has been climbing since she could walk." Santos was already barking more orders, and Cadet Okonkwo had found a broken hover transport in the equipment yard and was tearing into its power cell with a multi-tool. "What are you building?" an Elorian cadet asked nervously. "EMP device," Okonkwo answered without looking up. "And this power cell has enough juice to fry every unshielded electronic system within 200 meters. But that transport was decommissioned because the power cell was unstable." Okonkwo grinned and said, "That is what makes it perfect." Across the sector, Cadet Volkov had organized 3 other humans, and they were digging trenches at a speed that seemed physically impossible. They did not use powered equipment because the supply depot had none available, and instead, they used simple shovels and their own muscle power, but they dug like machines, and the earth flew from their trenches in continuous arcs, and within 20 minutes, they had created a network of concealed passages connecting multiple positions. An elderly Movari instructor wandered over to observe, and his mouth fell open in shock. "How are you digging so fast?" He asked. Volkov paused just long enough to wipe sweat from his forehead and answered, "We grew up on farms and ranches and construction sites, and digging holes is basically a human hobby." The Mulvari had no response to this and simply walked away looking deeply troubled. But the most alarming activity was happening at the supply depot itself, where Santos had discovered a collection of decommissioned mining equipment. The laser drills were meant for ore extraction and had been removed from service because they were considered too powerful and too dangerous for training purposes. Santos examined them for about 5 minutes and then started rewiring their targeting systems. Cadet Santos, Commandant Zrevish called out with concern in her voice, "What exactly are you doing with that equipment?" "Turning them into surface-to-orbit defense cannons," Santos replied cheerfully. "Is that safe?" Santos shrugged and said, "Probably not, but that is what makes it fun." 57 minutes after the exercise began, the human sector had transformed into something that the other cadets could barely comprehend. There were weapons and traps and hidden positions and early warning systems and enough firepower to challenge a small warship, and the humans had built all of it while laughing and joking and playing music from a small device that one cadet carried in her pocket. They danced between tasks and made jokes about the danger and competed with each other to see who could create the most impressive improvised weapon. They were having the time of their lives, and far above the planet in the cold darkness of space, the Sundari surveillance drone recorded everything and transmitted it back to High Commander Vorthexwo. watched with growing horror as his invasion plans crumbled before his eyes. The Revelation High Commander Vertex stood frozen before the display screen, and his three eyes locked on the images being transmitted from the surveillance drone. His talons gripped the edge of the console so tightly that the metal began to bend and crack under the pressure behind him. Fleet Tactician Silvera had gone completely silent, and her blue scales had faded to a pale shade that indicated extreme stress in her species. "Run it back," Vertex commanded, and his voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "Show me the last hour again from the beginning." The footage rewound and played once more, and Vertex watched the human cadets tear through their assigned sector like a force of nature. He watched Chun scale that impossible cliff, face without any protection, and reach the top in under 8 minutes. He watched Okonkwo transform a broken piece of equipment into a weapon capable of disabling an entire landing force. He watched Volkov and his team dig defensive positions faster than Sindari soldiers could manage with powered excavation tools, and he watched Santos convert mining lasers into surface-to-orbit cannons with the casual expertise of someone who had done similar things 100 times before. "This cannot be real," Admiral Krethener said from across the command center, and his voice trembled with disbelief. "Our intelligence must be wrong, and these must be elite soldiers disguised as cadets." "They are not," Silvera replied, and she pulled up the personnel files that their spies had obtained from Galactic Council databases. "I have verified their identities 3 times, and every single one of them is exactly what they appear to be." She highlighted Maria Santos on the display and continued, "This one is 21 years old by human counting, and she has never served in combat, and her only military experience is 4 years at their officer training program." The screen showed Santos laughing as she welded components together, and sparks flew around her unprotected face. Before she joined their military, she worked at something called a hardware store, where humans purchased tools and building materials for personal projects. Vertex felt something cold spreading through his chest as he processed this information. "You are telling me," he said slowly, "that this human who just built planetary defense weapons in less than an hour used to sell tools to civilians as her occupation?" "Yes, High Commander, and this is considered normal for their species." Silvera checked her data and answered, "According to our cultural analysis, humans frequently engage in what they call do-it-yourself projects, and they build and modify and repair things as a form of recreation." She pulled up more information and added, "Their young ones are often taught to use dangerous tools before they reach physical maturity, and many humans can operate welding equipment and power saws and explosive devices before they are legally considered adults." Vertex turned back to the display, just in time to see Santos finish her modifications to the mining lasers. She stepped back and examined her work with a critical eye, and then shouted something to the other cadets. "Translator," Vertex demanded. "What did she say?" The ship's computer processed the audio and replied. She said, "Fire in the hole," which is a human warning phrase, indicating imminent explosive or weapons discharge on the screen. Santos aimed one of her improvised cannons at a small asteroid in high orbit and pressed the firing control. The beam lanced upward through the atmosphere and struck the asteroid dead center. The rock vaporized instantly and left nothing but a cloud of dust and debris spreading through space. Santos nodded in satisfaction and made a note on her data tablet and then walked away to help dig more trenches. "High Commander," Silvera said quietly, and her voice carried the weight of terrible understanding. "Our troop transports have less armor than that asteroid." The silence that followed was absolute, and every officer in the command center understood what they had just witnessed. A young human with no combat experience had built a weapon capable of destroying their landing craft using equipment that was considered too dangerous for military training, and she had done it in less than an hour while treating the entire exercise as entertainment. "Show me the rest of their defenses," Vertex ordered, and his voice had gone flat and emotionless as his mind struggled to process the implications. The drone feed shifted to show the complete picture of what the humans had built. There were minefields constructed from fertilizer and cleaning chemicals combined in ways that created powerful explosives. There were concealed pit traps lined with sharpened stakes that would impale anyone who fell into them. There was an early warning system built from networked personal communication devices that would detect any approaching force. There were 3 separate fallback positions, with overlapping fields of fire that would turn any assault into a massacre. There was a tunnel network connecting all positions so defenders could move unseen and strike from unexpected directions. And there was something the humans had labeled Molotov cocktail production line, operating out of the Academy cafeteria. "What is a Molotov cocktail?" Admiral Krethner asked. Silvera consulted the translator database and answered, "It is an improvised incendiary weapon made from a glass container, filled with flammable liquid with a burning wick inserted in the top." She paused and added, "According to human history, these weapons were invented by civilians to destroy armored military vehicles, and they remain effective against modern equipment." Vertex watched the human cadets filling bottles with fuel and stuffing rags into the necks and stacking them in neat rows for easy access. They were singing while they worked, and the translator identified the song as something called "Working 9 to 5, which apparently described the tedium of civilian employment. "They are not taking this seriously," Krethner said with something like hope in his voice. "And perhaps these defenses are not as effective as they appear." Vertex shook his head slowly and replied, "No, Admiral, you misunderstand completely." He turned to face his officers, and his expression was grim. "They are taking this exactly as seriously as they need to, and no more, and this is recreational for them, and they are having fun." He gestured at the screen, where Santos was now teaching alien cadets how to construct their own improvised weapons. "This is what human children do for entertainment, and imagine what their adults do when they are actually trying." No one had an answer, and in the heavy silence of the command center, High Commander Vertex began to understand that his invasion was already over. He just had not accepted it yet. The Council of Fear, the War Council, assembled in the flagship's strategic chamber, and the mood was darker than the void between stars. Vertex sat at the head of the long table, and his senior officers filled the seats on either side, and every face reflected the same mixture of confusion and fear. The surveillance footage played on a loop on the main display, and the human cadets continued their work over and over again, as if mocking the assembled Sindari leadership. "We need to discuss our options," Vertex began, and his voice carried the weight of command, even though his confidence had been shattered. Admiral Krethner was the first to speak, and he leaned forward with his claws pressed against the table. "Perhaps we are overreacting to this situation," he said, and there was desperation in his tone. "These are improvised defenses built by inexperienced cadets, and our warships carry plasma bombardment systems capable of sterilizing an entire continent." He gestured at the display and continued, "We could simply bombard their positions from orbit before landing our troops, and nothing they have built could survive that kind of firepower." Vertex considered these words carefully before responding. "And then what?" he asked. "We turn a garden world into ash and glass and sacrifice the very prize we came to claim." He stood and began pacing around the table as he spoke. "Even if we were willing to destroy what we came to conquer, we would still face the larger problem." He stopped and turned to face his officers directly. "These humans came from somewhere, and they have a homeworld that we have never seen, and they have colonies spread across dozens of star systems, and they have fleets that patrol their territory." Vertex pulled up the intelligence files that the Sindari had gathered about humanity and projected them for all to see. Everything we know about humans comes from species we have conquered and from intercepted communications and from rumors that spread through the galactic community. The display showed Earth rotating slowly, and data points highlighted the various dangers that existed on its surface. Their homeworld has gravity nearly twice what the Sindari evolved under, and their young ones grow up carrying weight that would cripple our soldiers. More data appeared showing weather patterns and geological activity. Water falls from their sky as frozen projectiles, and their atmosphere generates electrical storms that destroy ships, and their ground shakes and splits open without warning. The display shifted to show images of Earth's wildlife. They share their world with predators that hunt in packs and prey that fights back with horns and hooves and poison, and they have creatures in their oceans so large that they could swallow our shuttles whole. Vertex let the images sink in before continuing, and the humans did not merely survive this nightmare world, but they conquered it completely, and then they reached beyond it to claim the stars. He returned to his seat and looked at each officer in turn. I have watched their children build planetary defenses from garbage in less time than it takes us to file a supply requisition. His voice dropped low and cold. What do you imagine their soldiers could do? And what about their veterans who have fought actual wars? And what about their scientists who create new weapons and their engineers who build their warships? The chamber fell silent as every officer contemplated these questions. Fleet Tactician Silvera spoke next, and her words were quiet but clear. I have been reviewing additional intelligence about human history, she said, and she pulled up new data on her tablet. They have a concept called total war, where their entire civilization mobilizes for conflict, and every factory produces weapons, and every civilian contributes to the war effort. She scrolled through historical records and continued. In one of their global conflicts, they increased their weapons production by over 300% in less than 4 of their years. The numbers appeared on the display and showed a curve of military output that climbed almost vertically. They built tens of thousands of aircraft and hundreds of ships and millions of weapons in a single conflict that lasted only 6 years. Admiral Krethner had gone pale, and his earlier confidence had completely evaporated. That is impossible, he said weakly. No species can mobilize that quickly. And yet they did, Silvera replied. And they have done it multiple times throughout their history. She added one final piece of information to the display. According to our cultural analysis, humans view war as a problem to be solved, rather than a natural state of existence, and when they identify a problem, they dedicate overwhelming resources to eliminating it completely. Vertex nodded slowly as understanding crystallized in his mind. So if we attack this planet, he said, we do not simply face the defenders present at that academy. He stood once more and walked to the main display, showing the green world that had seemed so ripe for conquest just hours ago. We announce ourselves as a threat to humanity, and we give them a reason to pay attention to us, and we become a problem that they will dedicate their species to solving. He turned back to his officers, and his expression was grim. The Sindari Collective has 200 warships in this fleet, and we have perhaps 1,000 more spread across our empire. He paused and let the numbers sink in. How many ships could the humans build if we gave them a reason to try? No one had an answer, and the silence stretched on as the implications became clear. This was not a battle they could win. This was not even a war they could survive. The only winning move was not to play at all, and Vertex began to understand what he would have to do, even though it would cost him everything he had worked for. The withdrawal. The decision came to Vertex in the dark hours of the night cycle, when the flagship was quiet and most of the crew had gone to their rest chambers. Stood alone at the observation deck and watched the distant green world spinning peacefully in the void. Kepler 442b was beautiful, and he could see why the Galactic Council had chosen it for their academy. and why so many species dreamed of claiming it for themselves. But some dreams were too dangerous to pursue. He activated his communicator and spoke the words that would end his career. All ships prepare for immediate withdrawal and set course for Sindari space. The response came within seconds as confused officers demanded explanations and questioned his orders and warned him about the consequences of abandoning the mission. Vertex ignored them all and simply repeated his command until the fleet began to move. Admiral Krethner arrived at the observation deck minutes later with fury burning in his eyes. "High Commander, you cannot do this," he said, and his voice was sharp with anger. "The Collective Council has authorized this invasion, and we have spent 40 cycles preparing for this moment. And you would throw it all away because of a training exercise." Vertex did not turn to face him, and instead kept his eyes on the green world growing smaller as the fleet accelerated away. "Yes," he said simply. "You will face court-martial for this decision," Krethner warned. "Yes, your career will be over, and your family will bear the shame, and your name will be remembered as the commander who lost his nerve." Vertex finally turned and met the Admiral's gaze. "Perhaps," he said, "but I will be alive to hear them say it, and so will you, and so will every soldier in this fleet." He gestured at the observation window and the world they were leaving behind. "I watched those human cadets today, Admiral, and I watched them build weapons of war while laughing and dancing and singing songs about civilian employment." His voice remained steady, but there was something haunted in his eyes. "They were bored, Admiral, and the challenge we presented was not enough to engage their full attention, and they treated planetary defense as a game to pass the time." He stepped closer to Krethner and lowered his voice. "What do you think would happen if we gave them a real challenge, and what would they build if they were actually trying, and how fast would they adapt if they faced a genuine threat?" Krethner had no answer. "I have commanded this fleet for 20 cycles, Vertex continued, "and I have won 43 battles and conquered 11 worlds, and I have never retreated from an enemy in my entire career." He paused and took a deep breath. "But I have also never been stupid enough to start a fight I cannot win. And today, I looked into the void, and the void was filled with Deathworlder children who think violence is entertainment." The fleet continued its withdrawal, and the green world shrank until it was just another point of light among the stars. Fleet tactician Silvera joined them on the observation deck, and she carried a data tablet with the preliminary report she had been preparing. "High Commander," she said quietly, "Central Command will demand an explanation for our withdrawal, and what should I tell them?" Vertex thought carefully before answering. "Tell them everything," he said finally, "and include all the surveillance footage and all the intelligence data and all the analysis we have conducted." He turned to face both officers directly. "Tell them I watched Deathworlder children build a planetary fortress in an hour while laughing and dancing to primitive audio recordings." His voice grew harder as he continued. "Tell them those children were bored by the challenge we represented, and tell them the youngest of those humans built surface-to-orbit weapons from decommissioned mining equipment." He walked to the observation window and placed one clawed hand against the cold glass. "Tell them that I refuse to discover what those children's parents are capable of when they are motivated by something other than boredom." Silvera nodded and made notes on her tablet. "And if Central Command orders us to return and complete the invasion?" she asked. Vertex was silent for a long moment before he answered. "Then Central Command can send another fleet with another commander who has not seen what I have seen." He looked back at his officers, and his expression was grim but resolute. "There are some worlds that are simply not worth conquering, and there are some species that should never under any circumstances be given a reason to pay attention to you." The fleet vanished into hyperspace and left the Kepler system empty and quiet on the planet below. The sun was setting over the Academy campus, and the training exercise had officially ended. Several hours ago, Commandant Zrevish and walked through the human defensive positions in stunned silence, and she had examined every weapon and trap and fortification with the eye of a veteran soldier. She found Maria Santos in the cafeteria helping to clean up the remains of the Molotov cocktail production line, and the young human looked tired but satisfied. Cadet Santos, the commandant said slowly. This was supposed to be a theoretical exercise where you planned defenses on paper and discussed them in class. Santos shrugged and replied, with respect, Commandant, where we come from, you do not plan for a fight unless you are ready to actually win it. And the mining lasers you converted into orbital defense weapons. Standard improvisation, ma'am, and my grandfather taught me how to modify equipment when I was 12, and he said you should always know how to turn tools into weapons just in case. The commandant stared at her for a long moment and seemed to be struggling with several different emotions at once. Your grandfather taught you to build weapons when you were 12 years old. Yes, ma'am, and my grandmother taught me demolitions, and my uncle taught me hand-to-hand combat, and my parents taught me to shoot. Santos smiled innocently and added, that is pretty normal where I come from, and most kids learn that stuff before high school. Commandant. Zrevish walked away without another word, and Santos heard her muttering something about needing to lie down and reconsidering career choices. The human cadets gathered in their barracks that night and talked about the exercise with the casual attitude of people who had faced nothing more challenging than a slightly interesting puzzle. I hope tomorrow's exercise is harder, Santos said as she settled into her bunk. Yeah, Chun agreed from across the room. Today was kind of easy, and I barely broke a sweat. Somewhere in the depths of space, the Zendari fleet raced toward home, carrying a warning that would spread throughout the collective. Do not attract the attention of the Deathworlders, or not give them a reason to care about you and whatever. You do never underestimate what their children can accomplish when they are bored, because if their bored children could build a planetary fortress in an hour, then their motivated adults could build something far worse, and no empire in the galaxy was prepared for that. The stars continued their eternal dance, and the green world of Kepler 442b spun peacefully through the void, completely unaware of how close it had come to war. And in her bunk, Maria Santos dreamed of harder challenges and more interesting problems and all the wonderful things she could build if someone actually gave her a good reason to try. The galaxy was fortunate that no one had, at least not yet,